Okay. Um, I am B. Ruby Rich. I'm the editor of Film Quarterly. Welcome all of you to our Page Views webinar, which we do with every issue based on um, the book that Bruno Guaraná has chosen for Page Views and based on the conversation he has initiated with the author. And this issue, this month, it's really wonderful to have Lynn Spigel here. So I am here with Bruno Guaraná, who's a master lecturer now at Boston University in my hometown, and with Lynn Spigel, who is the Francis Willard Professor of Screen Cultures at Northwestern University. And we're here to talk about her new book from Duke, TV Snapshots, an archive of everyday life. And let me just mention now, so we don't forget at the end, that Duke is having its renowned 50% off sale. So if anyone wants to get a bargain price for Lynn's book, this is the moment to do it. With that, we're going to get into the conversation. I'm here to moderate. I will jump in once in a while. But we like to begin by having Bruno tell you a bit about the book before the conversation starts. And I should just add that if you go onto the Film Quarterly website, you will find the conversation that Lynn and Bruno already had that has kind of sparked this version. And you'll also find free for download, I think the first chapter of her book. So this is what we like to do. There's a great library by now up on the Film Quarterly website of all the books that have constituted Page Views over these years. So it's a terrific resource, and I think we all have great taste, and it's a special pleasure to have Lynn Spigel here today. Bruno, it's on you now.
Thanks, Ruby. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Lynn, and thanks, Lynn, to sharing your research and for being so generous with your time. Lynn has also shared some photographs that we'll be featuring throughout our talk today to sort of illustrate what she's talking about in the book. So by way of an introduction to get people acquainted to the book, I'll briefly introduce it to people before I turn to Lynn and we'll start our conversation more properly. So I would guess that everyone here can think of a photograph that features a family member or themselves standing next to or in front of a TV set. And even though it's often thought of as something that mediates content, the TV set, we often forget that, is always still a thing existing in most living rooms, sometimes taking center stage, but more often than not occupying a good amount of living space. So in order to take a photograph of someone in that living room, decisions about framing or posing almost always have to take the television into consideration. No matter whether the TV inadvertently makes its way into that photograph or becomes a key object, right, a central focal point of it, it doesn't really matter as much as the subjects who are posing next to it, or in that case, our relatives. But that is only if you haven't read Lynn's latest book that I have here, TV Snapshots, an archive of everyday life. So what happened for this book is that Lynn took an interest in snapshot photographs of TV sets and spent nearly a decade collecting them from flea markets and online stores, and in turn amassing an archive of thousands of them. And even though only a handful of them featured people she personally knew, she set out to catalog, investigate, and analyze these rather generic snapshots. And the result is an engaging and surprising history of practices around television watching during the mid-century, primarily in the United States, but not only in the US. And this happened at a time when TV was becoming more and more common in households across the country. This archive of snapshots includes not just images of people next to their TV sets, but also those of individuals that show off their TV as the newly acquired technological device, or posing in varying degrees of dress up, from costumes to fancy attires, and even of undress in homemade versions of popular TV pinups, which is something that I definitely want to discuss today. And while it may seem that Spigel is just detailing a social practice of photographing that happened to include TV sets, these snapshots, in fact, enable new ways of conceiving and considering television culture. They reinforce some assumptions that we already have and correct others. So for all of TV and photography's targeting of families as sort of the primary locus of their use and value, the snapshots collected by Lynn underline a wide variety of TV consumers and of TV uses that don't constitute the common images of the distracted housewife, splitting her time between house chores and leisure, or the heteronormative family that gathers on the couch or on the floor to watch TV. What Lynn effectively does with these snapshots is turn the tables on TV history. So if we have mostly been concerned about what viewers saw play out on television, here she demonstrates instead what TV sets witnessed playing out in front of and surrounding them, right? So literally turning it around. And as she puts it, these snapshots enable a study of the home as a theater of everyday life, which goes beyond the picture-ready and picture-perfect families that are so prevalent in TV programming, advertisements, and manuals. And I think against the impression that the book's main subject might be photography, I think to me the crucial revelation is that it is indeed about cultural practices surrounding TV. These snapshots are not just intimately connected to, but also reveal a televisual and televised culture that replicates, dialogues with, and even opposes what is or was once on screen. And just to return briefly to the earlier exercise I proposed of recalling an image of a loved one standing next to a TV set, I'm sure that you will all sort of inadvertently find new TV snapshots everywhere all the time on family albums, even on picture frames hanging on your houses. And I say this as a testament to the generative and ever-expanding nature of Lynn's work. So in short, aided by these only apparently mundane sources, the book uncovers and recenters what is often neglected in TV history and studies, which is the material space television came to occupy starting in the mid-19th century, its liveness, and the people that utilize it for various ends, including, of course, taking and posing for snapshot photographs. So I would turn to Lynn to start from the beginning, which is sort of defining what she means by TV snapshots and sort of revealing to us how you got interested in this project to begin with.
Yeah, thank you so much. First, thank you to Ruby for that lovely introduction, and all of Film Quarterly for taking an interest in my book and writing about it and hosting this. And thank you, Bruno, especially for your interest in the book. And it's always great to hear somebody so eloquently describe what you did, because sometimes after you write a book, you think, what did I do? So it's nice to hear it makes sense in some way to someone, and how other people make sense of it. So
right.
I really appreciate that. So I got into this probably first and foremost when I was writing my first book, Make Room for TV. And I found a snapshot of myself as a little girl posing in front of my TV set. And I thought to myself at that point, and there it is, I thought to myself at that point, you know, this would be such a great last chapter to this book. And at that point, I couldn't find any. So I kind of searched for them at flea markets, but I really couldn't find any. So it wasn't until the 2010s when I started discovering them at flea markets and online. And I think it's because of that generation of TV watchers was passing away. There were many of these in lots of photographs at flea markets. And so there's this relationship between the quote death of analog TV or broadcast TV as we knew it, and the literal death of the spectators who watched it and the people who consumed it. And then I after I saw them at flea markets, I just on a hunch typed in TV snapshots to eBay, because I thought, you know, it's really needles in a haystack research to go to a flea market and just go through bins of photographs. And finally there's one, you know. But I typed in TV snapshots on eBay and found gazillions of them, and there's still just more and more and more every day. So that wound up being, you know, the online part of it wound up being a big part of how I collected the archive.
And so how do you identify a TV snapshot? Say I go to a flea market and look at the photographs. What would I send to you as a way of including in your archive? So
it is about people, or sometimes pets, posing with television. And there are deliberate ones where, and a lot of deliberate ones, where the television set is a backdrop or a prop, right? And that interested me because rather than being the focus of attention, that people were like in the ads for TV, people are circled around television watching the screen. in TV Snapshots, they are in front of the screen, on the side of it, sometimes in trick shots inside the television set. In other words, it's a practice of self-presentation, right? Of showing off yourself, your family, and often issues of gender and sexuality in front of the set. But there are snapshots where it's incidental in the shot, and I counted those too because I was interested in the way television was just part of interior decor or part of the practices of everyday life, that these snapshots gave some kind of visual evidence for.
And in a multidisciplinary way, right? You address this in the book a little bit, that you have to cut across histories of fashion and of architecture and decor, right? And all of this somewhat relate to cultures of television watching as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. The book, I mean, when I started the book, I didn't really know much about the history of photography or photography theory. So I really spent a long time sort of autodidactically teaching myself, and of course, learning from all of these great scholars who've written about this, right? But the book touches upon, numerous disciplines in order to kind of provide a context for the snapshots, which are, of course, found objects. I don't know anything about most of their authors, and so I kind of took a cue from Stuart Hall's notion of, reading photographs in terms of a politics of reading and placing them in the context of the people who posed for them. So that necessitated kind of interpreting them through multiple disciplines and multiple contexts of, trying to figure out how they relate to questions of race, of sexuality, of gender, as you say, of architecture, fashion, design.
I'm fascinated by this. As you mentioned, their nature as found objects, I think poses important challenges in this effort to contextualize and analyze them. Can you talk a little bit about, what is your process from getting a photograph to then analyzing it in depth?
So, yeah, I mean, the number one issue is, it's a challenge. It's not really a problem. It's interesting, that
Yeah, no, you're right.
they're found objects. You don't know who made them. They're very generic objects because snapshot cameras had only certain technological affordances. They could only do so much, right? They're based on certain kind of cultural assumptions of that technology, like, we all know that snapshot cameras were, like other forms of media, television itself, calibrated for whiteness, right? They were based on white flesh. So all of these things, make snapshots certainly not indexical, and you can't read them. We all know that as reflections of anything going on. So then it's, how do you set up an interpretive framework for them? And just at the practical level, I started, I guess, thinking of them thematically in groups, like, oh, there are a lot of them with holidays, or there are a lot of them with women in fashion glamour gowns, or there are a bunch of them with people climbing inside the TV set and taking trick shots, like hobby art ones, or ones where people were shooting off the screen and taking images of, the moon landing or the Kennedy assassination off the screen. So I started kind of dividing them thematically.
Let me jump in here for a second, because I think we're kind of teasing people. And since we have some of these snapshots, I think it would be a good moment to, Rebecca, if you can put a few of them up here, I think that will help ground. See, wonderful. And feel free, Lynn, if you want to comment on any of these and how they came into your possession, where you found them.
So, like the two that are up here now, the woman and the leopard, there's actually about 5 or 6 of her. So it's especially nice when you find sets of photos, right? People going back in this kind of ritual way to photograph themselves in front of the television set. So you start realizing it's a habitual and ritual practice, like this woman kind of dressing up. Here she's demonstrating her new TV, but in other ones, she's doing other things with it. And one of the great things about this archive, as Bruno was suggesting at the beginning, is it's not just kind of the classic white nuclear family in front of TV or circled around TV like you saw in ads. So the archive has a rich dimension of ethnic and racial and class differences. So that was really important to me. I was interested in ones like this, where people are like the group of people dancing, where people are dancing in front of the set. And that one really, well, both of these really interested me, again, in terms of race and the fact that on television at the time, you know, so many of the representations were so much about, you know, stereotypes or hegemonic acts of inclusion or exclusion. And people, it seemed to me, were making their own stories in front of the television set, performing, you know, as you see here, performing in joyous ways and using it really just as a backdrop and not as the focus of attention, right? So it wasn't like you're looking at images, you're looking at yourself. Or, you know, again, performance shots where the man with the guitar, the back of that snapshot actually says Mr. TD with that Colgate smile. So they're thinking about, people are thinking about, you know, we're not interested in the performers on TV. We're going to take snapshots of ourselves performing in front of it, right? And there's lots of those. So I devoted a chapter to that. Or, of course, the drag snapshot, which you know, there are numerous of these which really defy our expectations. This might be Halloween or a costume party. We don't know.
Right.
But you know, nevertheless, to me, it was really important that, you know, drag constituted kind of one of the ways you would pose with television at this time.
But she could also be relaxing at home and feeling free to show her true self. Like, we don't know. Right?
Yeah, we just don't know. Yeah. So, you know, you have to provide multiple possibilities. You know, I was interested, it looks like there are a kind of photo of herself on the photo on this. And also, you know, she's holding a cocktail glass, so it might be a party. So these photos call upon you to kind of, you know, have kind of stories and interpretations for them and open it up to other people's interpretations too.
You say something in the book that the pictures, rather than answers, they give clues to new questions to ask, right? And I think these are very illustrative of that. But the other thing I wanted to circle back to that refer to these photos is that you mentioned the importance of understanding the history of photography. And I think it's easy to sort of forget that these were analog photographs that, you know, even when the TV is in the backdrop, the framing and even the staging of the photograph was rather deliberate, right? So that suggests that there was some effort in preserving that image in that moment to the future.
Yeah, it's such an important point. It's John Berger's point that, you know, at the first level, a photograph tells you that someone thought it was important enough to document. Right.
And
so clearly there's something going on here where, you know, in all of these varieties, people are choosing to document themselves with television. And it goes past conspicuous consumption, which is kind of the first thing everybody always says, oh, well, they're showing off the TV set. But I think, as you can see from the range of things they're doing with TV, like having wedding performances and stuff, you know, that it's way more than just conspicuous consumption of the set. In fact, the set is often just a backdrop.
And I think the other thing that relates to that, this is, you know, you talk about how you struggled with organizing these images, and even your refusal in some ways to employ a digital software to catalog all of these. So where did you end up with this, and how do you think that honors also the, you know, in some ways the original intent of these photographs?
Yeah, because I mean, the first thing people kept saying was, oh, there's all this digital software and you can, you know, create, you know, online catalogs and organize them that way, because it is a mess. You know, I had like 5,000 of them. Right? So I tried the digital software and I couldn't stand looking at them that way, because they're just like tiny images and metadata, and they're not metadata. They're things people loved and cherished. So I decided that I was going to just put them in family albums, and I put them in family albums thematically, but it helped me work with them because it kind of reproduced that feeling, because it's so much about affect. I mean, you know, you can't have the same affect someone has for their family and their family snapshots, but after a while, they did kind of become friends to me, especially during the pandemic. You know, so,
that's right.
I knew them better than a lot of people. So, you know, they did take on that element.
Did you have any contact with the creators or relatives of creators of those photographs in any of these cases?
In a few cases. And now, because I created this kind of interactive website, where you can submit your own and tell a little story about yourself with it. I've gotten to know some people that way and their stories behind them. And it is kind of fascinating because, they're usually personal stories, because when we look at photos, we think about the people in them that we love. And so it adds like so many layers to it. But the people I talked to mostly were dealers, because I wanted to find out their strategies of collecting.
Huh. And so to return to the photograph and its analog nature, but also, its effective nature and the efforts to preserve something, were you faced with some ethical concerns in relationship to selecting, of course, but also exposing these images in the book that were meant for the private sphere?
Yeah, of course. And I talk about that in the book. I mean, you always feel like you're eavesdropping on people when you're dealing with their personal artifacts, right? And in this case, it's an intimate history of everyday life. And, and I really felt my own position as a white woman, like looking in on all these varieties of ethnicities and races of people. And because they're also global, I have a lot of photographs from around the world, you do feel like those issues of, questions of ethics and what you can say. I would say the ones that were most difficult to deal with is in the last chapter, where there are a lot of pinup snapshots, and there's actually a lot of snapshots of people posing nude in front of their television sets, which I chose not to put in. I think I put one in because they're not facing the camera. But, I just felt that it was probably wrong to kind of, because they're not, I only put nude ones in when they were in Playboy, because there were all these girly magazines that had women, professional models posing in front. But these are homemade ones where ordinary people are posing in bathing suits or in various stages of undress with the television set.
I think that the most revealing one that you have in that chapter particularly is of a man towards the end of the chapter, which sort of reverses that expectation that it would be the women undressing.
And go on.
No, go ahead, please.
I was just gonna go on to describe it. I mean, he's posing sort of in a classic nude with a TV guide used as a fig leaf over his penis. So it's particularly, and the TV guide, to add to this, has Judy Garland on the cover. So there's a certain kind of gay culture, I think, happening here. And I did get it from a collector who collects gay photography from the period. So it's, and there's actually more of men. I could talk about that a little later if people are interested in it. But the big thing I want to say about the chapter about the homemade pinups is that, to me, it really suggested something very different from what we think of the sweet family practices of television, the nuclear family, right? Because when technologies are new, they usually have pornography attached to them. The cinema did, and the internet does, and people think television didn't, and largely it's because it was regulated, right? But so sexuality was happening in front of the screen and not on it, so that's where we see the pornographic images.
Yeah, no, that chapter is really fascinating. And you mentioned the sort of the professionally made TV pinups that were, if I understand it correctly, quite popular, but also serve as models to some of the photographs, the amateur photographs that we do see throughout the chapter, right? So it's interesting to see the sexuality played out, outside of the TV, as I say, adjacent to the TV, and then in front of the TV.
There's millions of them in girly magazines in the period, but also defying expert, and people who study pinups know this, but many of the some of the most famous pinup photographers of the mid-century period were women, like Bunny Yeager. So that defies our expectation too. It's not necessarily only about women's objectification. So I was interested in reading the kind of pleasure women might have had taking these photographs. We don't know who was on the other side of the camera. Might have been another woman. We just don't know, So, but I don't want to see them only as self-objectification.
Yeah, and that also, in your book, that chapter serves as a counterpart to another chapter that talks about dress up photographs of women. So another way of a female presentation that I think dialogues also with images on television. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So that chapter is looking at lots and lots of photographs where women just dress up and pose in front of the set. And some background for this is that during the period there were a thing called TV clothes, and we've forgotten about that. So the garment industry, right, was trying to sell women on the idea that they needed to have special clothes to watch TV in to look good, right? Especially if they were going to have TV parties, and that they needed to have, and that relates to the idea that, which was put forward in women's magazines and ads and all sorts of popular culture, that television was competing for attention with women for men, right? So that it was men were watching TV and not women, and they were watching other women on TV, but they might also just be watching a boxing match. So TV was kind of figured as the other woman, right? Mm-hmm. So these ads, these snapshots of women all dressed up kind of speak back to that dynamic and speak to the whole kind of fashion industry around TV. They're also kind of ritual photos where I have sets of them where the same woman will come back several years later in a different outfit and model day wear and evening wear and those kinds of things. And I was interested too, especially in the ones with African-American women, because women of color were represented on television, as we know, in such either kind of mammy roles or in exoticized roles, and would appear in this period mostly as guest stars, and not the main attraction. It was always the white woman who was the lead and main attraction. So I was interested in, I kind of used Bell Hooks's idea about the snapshot camera as an oppositional tool. I was interested in the way women of color could use the snapshot camera as an oppositional tool against these, either lack of or stereotypical images of themselves on television, and kind of represent themselves as, glamorous women in their everyday life, and just use television again as a background and not the main attraction.
I wonder if there was any overlap in that period between that and images in Ebony magazine or Jet magazine, where you would have seen more of that kind of counterpart and that kind of other framing.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, in the chapter I talk about precisely that, the kinds of ways in which Ebony, Jet, the history of Black fashion magazines kind of spoke back to the racism of glamour since the 19th century, really. But, increasingly in this period, that was tied to civil rights discourses. It wasn't really about like women's self-presentation. Like being glamorous was also about civil rights. So I was really interested in that relationship here.
Cool. And I was also thinking about it in terms of economics. What did it mean to show off the kind of television you had, that you had purchased? Was it like a car where you were sort of demonstrating your social status by showing it?
I think, in some of them it was, especially in the demonstrational ones early on, and even if you got a second TV. But as I was saying, I don't think conspicuous consumption really accounts for the variety of practices, right? And so that's there, but I think it's a weak explanation. I think it's there, but not the really main thing that at least I had to say about this.
Yeah, so you talk about early photographs of people using the dials, right? Or sort of almost like demonstrating how television works, and in other instances in which you have a subject appearing in different photographs with different TV sets across the years. And then my favorite example of that is when a TV set is standing on top of another TV set, which sounds crazy to me, but I think it happens more than once, at least in the book.
It happens. It happens really a lot. I have many photographs of double TVs, even triple TVs, and so I had one of my grandmother with her double TVs, and I put it in the book. But to me, when I looked at that photo, I always, because it was she had a color TV that my grandfather bought for her right before he passed away, right? And when the color TV broke, she bought a cheap portable and put it on top, right? So it really defies ideas about planned obsolescence. You know what I mean? That people would throw away the old thing because it was a sentimental object. And when I looked at that photo, or even just at it in her home, I just always thought of my missing grandfather. And she put her wedding anniversary bell next to it as a decoration, you know? So I think like that probably was going on for other people, that it's more than just utilitarian, it's a sentimental object, you know, as well.
I love that anecdote. And it's the kind of history that you don't get just by looking at a photograph, right? The deep history that's effective rather than
since then, other people have told me similar kinds of stories.
Yeah, yeah. So the other kind of TV shots that I find really interesting are what you call trick shots or screenshots. What are they? What do they look like?
I'm not sure if we have any available on this, but they're basically people climbing into the television set and emptying it out, you know, and then climbing inside. And
there you go. Yeah.
Yeah, you can see one there where this woman, if anyone knows the I Love Lucy episode where she does vitamin to Vegemin and actually climbs into the TV set, people always kind of think maybe this woman is mimicking that. But there's a lot of these, right? And so it's part of kind of the performance, but to me, it's also part of the uncanniness of television in the home. Like, you know, what's the status of the image? Is it live? Is it real? Is it, you know, and it's playing with that, as all trick shots often do, no matter what the subject matter is. It's playing with uncanniness.
And the other one is our screenshots, right? Which sounds so, I guess, current of a term, but you're referring to a slightly different practice than we would think.
Yeah, well, that was an actual hobby art during the 1950s and into the 60s, where people could like win prizes at contests for creating the best screenshot. In other words, taking a photo of anything. You know, sometimes they're garden variety performances or dramas on TV. Sometimes they're media events like Kennedy or the moon landing. But it was very hard to take a photo off screen. Some of us still remember that when we used to try to publish before digital television, right? That we would literally take photographs off the screen. I think some of my early books have those terrible murky shots. So it was like, it was a professional thing. And if you could do it well, there was a show called Photographic Horizons, which allowed people to take photographs off the set. It was a pinup girl, and it allowed people at home to take photos of the pinup girl off the set and then compete for the best photo. So it was, it was a kind of, you know, cultural popular practice at the time.
Right. And as you say, not a challenging one of that, right? It's not easy to take the photo of the screen without reflecting the flash or exposing it properly. There's something that I wanted you to talk about because I found it so fascinating, and you addressed it briefly in the book. I guess it's not central, but I think it nicely illustrates this convergence of the two media, photography and television, now from the industry side, which is I wrote it here, the Sylvania Scanner Color Slide Theater.
Oh yeah.
What is that? What does it look like?
It was one of these early goofy contraptions before home video, you know, takes off. It's a television set that you can put your family slides on, and you can also record audio. It had a tape recorder in it, so you could, and it advertised itself as like, put your family on TV, right? So to me, that was like the industry's attempt to now kind of, you know, incorporate this practice of photography and television. It eventually becomes home video, right? Not too long after. But it's always interesting, I think, to see those kind of failed technologies, like whatever the scanner or Sylvania recorder or TV, right? That are clunky old technologies that are aspiring to something new, but also drawing on practices that already exist at the popular level.
Yeah, it seems like even that the way that the device is advertised refers to this practice that's happening, right?
Yeah.
So again, as you say, it is an ubiquitous practice that we may not have paid attention to enough, but that was also acknowledged at the time.
Well, and it's their lack of realization that it's going to create a new technology for this next phase, and that they're actually not going to have that space there. They're not going to own that. space, and Sylvania will be forgotten until just this moment. So it's amusing for so many different reasons.
Yeah.
And then,
yeah.
Ruby,
Go
did
on,
you want
Bruno.
to ask something?
No, go ahead.
I wanted to talk about so we've talked about the four main categories of TV snapshots, right? The one in which the TV is an object and it has a presence within these images. Then the one with trick shots or screenshots, so the television is a central focus, and then dress up snapshots and TV pinups. How did you arrive at these categories, and were there other categories that might have been left out that did not serve you
Great
enough?
question, because I think with any history, you have to finally pick and choose the story, or you're going to, I arrived at it largely through repetitions. I mean, I saw photographs which were continually repeating this, but somebody else might have had a chapter called holidays, and so why didn't I foreground holidays? Because there were tons of Christmas photos, right? So some of it has to do with the ways I wanted to make these photographs interesting. And I think from that point of view, there's always, the historians always telling their story too. And I do think other people, and hope, will have their own stories. It's kind of why I created the website along with the book, because, I think it's possible to read a lot of different kinds of things into these photographs, apart from the ones I direct readers to read. And, it's like a scrapbooking practice. What I find to be the ones that go together in certain ways, of course, they have to do with my personal interests in fashion, architecture, and sexuality, and race, right?
And it echoes your previous research as well, right? Which neatly accounts for this. You called it sort of a counterpart to your first book. And I think it's a nice way to describe that.
Yeah.
I'm going to, I know this is a great conversation. I'd like to keep it going, but I also am mindful of the fact that we've got a great audience and they're beginning to come in with questions. So let me introduce some of those, okay? Anna Briggs has this question. Do you feel that often people would pose in front of the TV because it's become the focal point of a family room? The seating area is the natural place to be the observer / photographer, and the TV area is the natural spotlight where the object of the gaze is seen. I love this, Anna. Shining, luminous, beautiful, dreamy, fantastic, dramatic.
Yeah, that is nice. I do, and I talk about that in the book, like the seating arrangement. It is kind of, especially in the small homes, of course, post-war America, right, or small apartments, people were told to make it the focal point of the room. It takes the place of the fireplace often, which was a posing place. Kodak would always tell people to pose at the fireplace. But what interested me is that it's not what's on TV that's the focus. And it's not even often the TV set, because people often block it out, right? What happens is this focal point creates an empty space in the room, and that creates a posing space, right? It becomes a space where people can pose. So it's important that it's a focal point in the room, but it's not the focal point for watching TV anymore. It's a focal point for doing all sorts of things. Women work in front of it, children play in front of it. There's tons of messy things in front of it. There's, everyday life happens in front of it, and posing happens in front of it. So I hope that answers that, but I think it's yes, both at once.
Great. There's another question here from Ezra Simensioglu. Saying it's really fascinating to see TV both as decor and as being decorated with various ornaments or being a part of a media showcase. And it has this story. I remember as a kid, I was banned from touching TV. It was placed in a huge media wall as if it were a museum object. And I was not allowed to change anything on this wall. And the buttons were also taped. Perhaps as an early parental control. Maybe it was a cultural thing, but your childhood photo reminded me of the relationship between kids and TV. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I have several thoughts about several things that brought up. One is the kind of TV in the wall idea, which I've written about separately elsewhere. Media objects in storage walls and shelving design and all of that as sort of camouflaged. I talk a little bit about that in this book. So it's actually especially for high-end families during this time. TV was no longer a status object. In the 40s, it was a rich person's toy. By the end of the 40s, it becomes a mass object. So in the high-end design journals, they're showing people how to hide TV in media cabinets. I don't know if the person with this question was a high-end family, but by the 70s, it becomes low-end anyway, like everybody's hiding TV in those cabinets. The children thing, I do think it's really fascinating. And that so much of the time in the performance shots, especially, people would kind of show off their little stars and amateur stars performing in front of TV, right? And that's a place where that goes for sure. That if there's kind of parental concerns during the period, which there are, about children watching TV and growing pale and weak and things like that, there definitely were discussions of that in the popular press and women's magazines. I talk about that a lot in my first book, Make Room for TV. People are showing off their children in front of the TV. They're often baby shots with people like their newborn baby on their TV set. Like they're both newborns. So it is really interesting how showing off your child and showing off your TV set become related to each other.
These two up here now, they went away. I was going to say those two that were up there just now were terrific. I didn't know if you had any information on either of those.
Yeah, the woman in the red gown is just fabulous, isn't she? She speaks for herself. It's one of those glamour shots, and it's also about women who, there are all these shots about women who would dress up, and they're going out. Like she's got a cape on, but a lot of them have purses or hats or gloves. And so I call television a kind of portal object. You would stand by it before you went out for the night. And it's a ritual practice of take the shot and then go out. So it also speaks to the fact that I don't think television was just making women kind of captive in their own homes. You see plenty of women, which was the fear at the time, that women would never get out in women's magazines. I talk about that a lot in Make Room for TV. But here you kind of see that it's also a going out object, that, it's about kind of a ritual place to pose before you leave home. And the little boy with the violin, he's part of a triptych. And I love this one because he's playing his violin, and another shot, he's got it even higher under his chin. And then the last shot, he and his mother are hugging afterward. So people would create little stories and narratives with these TV photos. Are really interesting.
I want to bring in the other question we have pending, because especially with our lady in red, Amanda Chung has asked, have you come across any images of TV stars posing in front of a TV set with a show featuring them in it?
Yes, so, I have. And I'm trying, they're usually minor TV stars, but I'm not sure if there's one of Frank Sinatra, but I'm not sure if he's actually in the set. Maybe it's Tab Hunter. But there's a whole bunch of celebrity ones like this, I have one in the book of Elizabeth Taylor with an ordinary snapshot of a woman who seems to be imitating Elizabeth Taylor. So that's kind of interesting too. But there's a whole set of celebrity ones from this period and up through like Warhol, posing in front of his TV set.
See, now I'm tempted to ask, what kind of TV did Warhol have? That's sorry, I know it's a trick.
All I remember was there was a big moose head over it. But I think it was a wood console with a big moose head over it.
The picture of the little boy also reflects what Anna mentioned in her question of the TV as being the central focal point, right? So if the kid is performing, he's naturally going to gravitate towards that focal point where people are used to watching performances.
Exactly,
right?
And it's important that they're becoming like using TV as a framing device for their own kind of home mode stardom and own presentation of self, right? But the focal point nature of it is really important to that. Yes.
And I wanted to address something earlier. You are dealing with collections and creating an archive of your own. And as with any archive, it contains gaps, right? Some of which are out of practical reasons because you can't really possibly collect everything that exists. And some of these are by design or or you choose that these gaps remain as gaps rather than filling them up. And this is the case with a photograph that you describe in the book of Emmett Till posing in front of a TV. And yet you call that the missing picture. You choose not to include it in your book, and you say that you struggle with categorizing it or finding a place for it in your book. Can you tell us a little bit about your decision about that photograph?
Yeah, I'm still sort of unsure it was the right decision, but it's in the last chapter on TV memory and the archiving practices around this, because there's a whole bunch of collectors who kind of chat about these snapshots online. And, I'm one of them, obviously both a historian and a collector. And I noticed, because I knew about the snapshot of Emmett Till, and it's taken shortly before he was murdered. And it never appears on Pinterest or Flickr or any of those archives. So that's why I called it kind of the missing photograph in this. Like, it seems to be, not in this archive, right? And it's not in this archive because it's, obviously its own horrific moment, right? But I wanted to talk about it, and I do talk about it, so there's thick description of it, but I decided that, and I wanted to talk about it because I think it troubles the racial innocence around, especially around childhood innocence, right? And that you can look at these photos and just think they're all kitschy or cute, or, but when you think about the Emmett Till photo, it's also kind of troubles that notion of how, the 50s or 60s is this kind of innocent moment. So I wanted to talk about it for all of those reasons, but I didn't want to kind of disrupt, it made me to put it in Emmett Till's casket. And I didn't want to kind of disrupt its place in the history of civil rights and in her relation to it. So I decided not to put it in the book. I mean, it's easily found online. It's been discussed endlessly, right?
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's not his most famous photograph, right? But as you say, it's sort of, it stays in his coffin. So there is almost like this sacred place to which it goes. That
exactly.
I
And
guess
she enlarged it and had it on her wall later in life.
And it was of him posing in front of his TV set. Is
like
that right?
All these other ones,
like all the rest of them,
smiling and happy. And there's this strange kind of ghost of the CBS logo on the screen. So it's a haunting photograph in so many ways, obviously.
But of course, we don't know what happened to any of these other people posing in front of their TVs. We have no way of knowing what when you turn the page, what happened next.
I know.
So that's a reminder of that as well.
Yeah, that's a great point.
There's another question here from Anna Briggs, and just we're coming toward the end. We have 10 minutes left. So if anyone else is harboring a question, feel free to post it. But in the meantime, Anna Briggs says now that there's an interesting shot of Jim Morrison literally in the closet with a TV showing a glamorous lady who looks perhaps like Jean Harlow, and posing inside Chateau Marmont. So there's a link there if anyone wants to see that.
Definitely. That's great.
Good addition. Good addition. Yeah. So I really loved your point in the book, Lynn, about the kind of customization of media, about how people used media technologies in connection with one another, talking about the snapshot framing the television set, the one that they are able to use to create, and the one that they're not, because it would be many years before they could get the video camera. So, yeah.
And I was thinking about them as companion technologies, before convergence, right? They're not not exactly convergence culture yet, but it's the two dominant family image modes of the period, or two dominant image modes, the snapshot camera and the television, right? And people are finding alternative practices. We're not going to watch TV. We're going to use our cameras in conjunction with the television set to create this new practice. So it's a little like convergent culture, but not quite the same. And
nice. Nice. There's another really interesting point that just came in from Andre Jose Ramos. Congratulations, Lynn, for the book. In the late 80s in Chiapas, Mexico, during his teenage years, his parents were radical Marxists who profoundly believed TV was a toxic ideological apparatus device technology. Thus, they never purchased a TV set, and watching television was stigmatized and prohibited, and TV was therefore a meaningful absence. At one point, we were storing some furniture for a relative who was abroad, and among the things they were storing in cardboard boxes was a small portable TV. And he talks here about how his sister and he would secretly unpack the portable TV, hide under the bed, and watch the most popular telenovela of that moment. So that's a wonderful story.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing it so much. Because, and I do think that's the thing, when like the possibility of online archives, everything's about presence. Oh, there's another photo. There's another photo.
Mhm.
There's another photo. And you forget about absence. And I talk about this a lot in the last chapter, those things that are absent. And yes, many people didn't have TVs in the house for varieties of reasons, right? But your story about kind of sneaking TV is, such a great memory of the moment, and I think it speaks also, to childhood, to the global transfer of all these photos. So thank you.
And now a great anecdote from Dee Dee Halleck. Thanks, Dee Dee, saying, I sent a picture in to Lynn of my two sisters in front of a TV set in Cuba. My father took it to prove to our relatives and friends back in the States that Cuba was civilized, even in a mining camp 600 miles from Havana.
Yeah, and they're such great, beautiful photos. You really need to look at them. Thank you, Dee Dee. I love them.
I saw that some of those were up there on the website. I noticed some of Dee Dee's. That was just great.
Yeah, they are. They're really.
So we encourage the rest of you. We encourage the rest of you here.
If Laura
take this
is
opportunity.
still here, she sent in some beautiful ones too. I don't know if Laura's still here, but of her parents' wedding or grandparents' wedding photo in front of the television set, which is another thing people did a lot in front of TV, have wedding photos.
And who was that? That got cut off.
Laura LaCapla.
Great, great.
Lynn,
Yeah.
you talk about, I think the conclusion to the book, you called it Hard Stop. I think pointing to this, like the infinite possibilities of unraveling this archive into something that's absolutely unmanageable, even more unmanageable than what you worked with. And this leads me to a curiosity that I have. If you have come across new things that since you finished the book, right, with putting it out there and having people send you new things that of course didn't make it to your book, but that attest to its expansive nature.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, as you say, like you're happy when you find things, but you're also like, oh, that's such a great one, and I should have put it in there. I recently came across Tamara Reese's TV photo, and she was the third transgender woman in 1955 to get us surgery, and an AP photo, newspaper photo of her shows her vacuuming in front of her television set. And I thought, it's such a trope, even this has, it's amazing, so things like that have been, it's both pleasing to see because, it's expanding, but then you're like, but that was such a great one and I missed it,
But that's so emblematic. That's how emblematic it was that it would show up even there.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Bruno, were there last things you wanted to say? And also, Rebecca, were there any images we didn't get to? I want to make sure we're not leaving anything off here. Aha.
Yeah,
Okay.
this on the left is one of my favorites.
Okay. Lynn, comments?
Well, for one thing, something we didn't discuss was I was really interested in the queer spatial orientations that these photos give rise to, and borrowing Sarah Amid's term queer orientation. And I do mean it in terms of queer, but I also just mean it in terms of, orientations towards TV. We don't know because we couldn't see them, right? And so in this case, a woman literally has her back to the television set. In other words, they're climbing inside of it. In other words, like this one, looks like she's posing with a guy on TV, which image is real, the uncanniness of these queer orientations. So yeah, I speak about these kinds of questions about spatial orientation a lot in the book. Yeah, these are lovely.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Oh,
Here's one of
my.
the pin-up ones.
Yeah. And the wedding cake.
with a date,
Yeah.
which is not very common, right?
I'd say at least half of them had dates, but
Yeah, that was very common in photo processing back then for some
Yeah.
reason.
Hmm.
Oh, what about these?
you can see too, they go into the 70s. And I had to stop in 77 because of copyright laws, but they actually continue through the 90s. So, I mean, it's a residual practice later on. I think it's a dominant practice in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, and it peters out. But, you know, there are still TV photos in the 90s.
I
We
have
have,
to say, it's hard to top the one of you.
We have a comment here from Dana, Ruby, if you want to
Oh, great.
relate
Great.
to
Thanks.
us.
Thank you. Good. So Dana Pullen, going back to the person who mentioned their TV controls being taped over to prevent kids from changing them, I wonder if that would have been a consideration in lots of families around color TV, where the early sets had special knobs to get the primary colors to blend correctly. Many of your photos are, of course, about the TV being off during the photo, but is there anything to be said about the distinction between black and white and color?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dana. Thank you. And I just want to shout out to Dana because he helped me so much with this book. So, so he deserves a special thank you. But yeah, the color question is really interesting. And I hadn't thought too much about that. Maybe Susan Murray with her wonderful book on color TV could help us with that. But I do think it's a really interesting question. I'll just give you my personal memory of color TV and reveal that my dad was a TV repairman and we didn't have a lot of money. So when color TV first came, and for a little while he had a shop, he had a color television set, but he wouldn't buy us one because we didn't have enough money. So we used to go down in our pajamas to watch the Flintstones in color. You know? So I was one of the kids that was allowed to watch TV, but I had a special dad. But yeah, I mean, I think that whole thing about prohibiting children from watching by taping up the dials, and what Dana just raised about color, these are all avenues that are, you know, fascinating and worthy of like more research. If it's possible. I do feel like I was rather obsessive in this book with my interest in all these snapshots.
Great. Well, this is a wonderful note to end on. We're at time. There's this great, lovely comment here to lead us off from Josh Tyree saying, television as portal object. Thanks very much for this inspiring critical event and these amazing images. And yeah. That's
I should say
terrific.
you can find the images on just type the website tvalbum.com where Lynn is exhibiting them, and you know, you can scroll through them.
Great. And see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.